So, yeah, one of my earliest memories is of lying in the crook of my mother's arm, being read stories to. And I couldn't read then, so I really looked forward to these times. And the stories, coupled with that feeling of being safe and warm, became a sort of a sanctuary that I retreated to at the end of every day. My mother herself was an extraordinary human being, completely tuned into other people's sensitivities and sensibilities, as well as to the natural world around her. It was from her that I learned to observe what the poet Mary Oliver calls the small kingdoms. I have a distinct memory of a time when the wind was blowing through the tall eucalyptus trees in our garden, making them creak really loudly. And when I asked my mother what that sound was, she said very matter-of-factly, "Oh, that's just the trees talking to one another." I was gobsmacked. I mean, I wanted to know what they were saying to each other. I wanted to be in on that secret. And when I told my mother this, she said, if I was very still and listened very, very carefully, I would understand what they were saying. I would understand their language. So I did that for hours on end. And looking back, I imagine that was an ingenious way to get a very curious child who badgered you with questions day in, day out to just be quiet for some time. But knowing my mother, it probably just transcended convenience, and it was her way of getting me to bear witness to the world around me. Did I finally learn the language of the trees? I'd like to believe I did. And if you want to know what it is, I'm sorry, you're going to have to do what I did all those years ago. Find a couple of trees, sit down beside them, and listen very carefully. It was a magical childhood, thanks to this woman. But this is where my own story takes a bit of a twist. Over the years, I found out that she was not my biological mother. In fact, she was my real mother's sister and had legally adopted me. For reasons I won't get into here, she never married. She held a lot of sadness within her, turned to various substances for comfort, and attempted to end her life on more than one occasion. And it's around this time that my real mother, another absolutely stunning human being who I'm so glad is here today, she was pregnant with me and decided that the only way to save her sister's life was to give her someone to love unconditionally. And that someone happened to be me, but that's a story for another time. Johann Hari, in another amazing TED talk about addiction, shares this blazingly remarkable insight. He says, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And I believe that it was the connection that my adoptive mum, Jayanti, and I developed and forged over many years that finally got her to turn away from her own addictions. When I turned 17, just having finished high school and at peace somewhat with this whole reality of the adoption, my adoptive mum, Jayanti, got sick. She got cancer. And what followed were two of the most brutally painful years of her life, and ours as well. She was whisked away to a city. There was zero talk of pain management, and the phrase palliative care did not even feature in the hundreds of books that I scoured trying to demystify her illness. And the rhetoric of war that, so often accompanies cancer was everywhere. Fight, battle, survive. I mean, my mother begged us to stop, but we didn't. We would not put down our weapons, and we would not let her rest either. She really struggled to keep her dignity, and when she asked to stop treatments that were hurting her more than helping her, she was accused of giving up, and we all chimed in. We didn't think then that there was any grace in accepting one's mortality with equanimity. All she really wanted to do was to go back to her house in the Nilgiris, her home, and be surrounded by her beloved mountains and trees, but she never made it back. When death finally came, as it happens with so many of us, our grief was mingled with this guilty relief that this whole ordeal was finally over. The suffering had ended. I was devastated, as was anyone who loved and knew her. This radiant light of our lives had gone out. But I recall that on a particularly demonic day, a few weeks before she died, when I was really struggling with my own grief, she called me into her room and she said this to me. She said, if you don't do a single good thing for the rest of your life, know that you gave me my 19 best years. The 19 happiest and healthiest years I have known when I rediscovered joy. And that changed everything. It changed everything for me. I knew right then that if there was any good that was going to come out of this absolutely horrifying ordeal that we were put through, it was if I continued to do something good. But what that good was, I hadn't a clue yet. About 20 days after she died, I, quite by accident, stumbled across palliative care. We had wanted to donate her ridiculously expensive medication to people who couldn't afford it. And by some strange intervention, I was directed to this hospice. Neither the person who sent me there nor I knew what a hospice was at that point. And when I got there and it was explained to me, I was astounded that such a place existed and that pain could actually be managed. And absolutely nobody had told us about it. So there it was. I knew right then what I was going to do for the rest of my life. I was already a student of psychology, but I decided in that moment that I would be a palliative care psychologist, and I would listen, just like my mother had taught me, to listen to the trees, to the stories of people who were sick and dying. And if I was very still and listened very, very carefully, I would understand what they were saying, and I would be allowed into that sacred space. In palliative care, we have this notion of total pain, pain that takes into account the life circumstances of the patient that contribute to his or her experience of suffering. I came across that concept quite early in my life, and in my career, and I thought I understood it, theoretically at least. And then one day, the home care team that I was a part of was called in to see this fisherman in one of the outlying villages of Trivandrum. We parked our van some 400 meters away, made our way down this narrow, undulating path. We could hear this man's screams well before we got to his house. And on approaching the house, we were assaulted by this stench, which made me gag. And when we entered his home, we were met by this helpless young woman, and behind her on the bed, a man in his 40s, who was the source of the screams. He had a myriad problems and a feeding tube. And on closer examination, we found that he also had a bowel obstruction that was not allowing him to pass what his wife was so diligently feeding him because she didn't know what else to do to look after him. And as a result, he was regurgitating his own waste. It was awful. Anyway, he was cleaned up, analgesics and other medication were administered, but no matter what we did, his pain would not fall below 6 on the pain scale, which is essentially a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, where we ask people to score their subjective pain. So finally, this benevolent and wise doctor that I have the absolute privilege of calling my mentor, he took this man's hand in his own, and he asked him, he said, "What's your biggest concern right now? What is bothering you?" What an odd question, I thought. I mean, the pain, the humiliation, the despair, and just the misery of everything that he was experiencing. I mean, the answer was glaringly obvious to me. The man didn't say anything for a long time, and I started to get fidgety. The silence was starting to get awkward and strained, to me at least. But the good doctor, he held steadfast. And after about 6 long minutes, and I know this because I was timing it, this man very softly said, "All I wanted was for my children not to be fishermen. And now they're going to be just that." He knew he was dying, and he knew that his wife would not be able to support the children on her own, and this one fact was causing him far more agony than anything else that he was going through. So one of the things we strive to do in our program is to undertake the educational needs of children from disease-ravaged families that can no longer afford to send them to school. But this process takes about a week from when the child has been identified. In this case, however, we sped up the processes. Donors were found, pledges were made, documents were signed, all to see these 2 children, aged 8 and 10, through to college. We returned to the fisherman's house the next morning, and he was asked what his pain was. "Still 6, he said. He was then shown the documents, and he was told, "It is done. Your children will not be fishermen." The transformation on that man's face was magical. And once he had digested that information, he was very gently asked one more time, "What is your pain now?" 1. He died 3 days later, pain-free. And that, my friends, is total pain. And that was when I truly learned my first lesson in being still and allowing a story to emerge. In March 2019, this year, the Medical Council of India very wisely introduced a new module to its curriculum, existing MBBS curriculum, which is called 8COM. It stands for Attitude, Ethics, and Communication. It's wonderful that these aspects are now being recognized as being vital to a doctor's education. Prior to this, forget palliative care. I mean, physical pain management was taught for a grand total of 1 hour in the entire medical curriculum. And it was a non-examinable subject, by the way, essentially sending out the message that alleviating someone of their pain is not a priority. In a world of ever-increasing technology, today we have machines and instruments that can measure the subtlest waves, that can detect the most minuscule changes in calibration, and can tell you what is wrong with you down to a cellular level. It can catch the slightest flutter of the heart. But why does that heart flutter? What makes it sing? What gives it peace? No instrument of science can tell you that. For that, you have to listen, you have to touch, and you have to be present. We once had a patient come into our care. He presented with this massive fungating wound on his face, packed solid with maggots. As per usual, he was cleaned up and he was given whatever medication necessary. But he just sat there day after day, listlessly, just staring at the wall, refusing to even look at another human being, completely disengaged. So one of our social workers went and sat with him, and after a few days of just being present, he asked this man what he missed most about his life prior to falling sick. And it turns out that this man had been a farmer all his life, and his connection with his plot of land, his tiny plot of land, ran far deeper than anything else. From it, he had learned the shifting patterns of seasons, the language of clouds, the importance of treating water with respect. It had fed him. It had put his children through school. And here he was, confined within these 4 walls, completely cut away from it. So what could we do? He was in no condition to be cared for effectively at home. His time was actually very nearly up. So we brought some potted plants into his room, and we told him that we needed his help in caring for them. 0 response. So we left them in a corner and walked away. The following day, when we went to see him, we found that the plants were now by the open window catching some sun. And he was busy fussing over them, and he told us, to change the soil, get better drainage, this, that, whatever. Basically, he re-engaged. Around that time, we were bumbling around trying to set up a vegetable patch on our terrace. And when we told him that, he was up there like a shot, out of his room, up 2 flights of stairs, while earlier he would not even leave his bed. And the vegetables that he helped us nurture, I have to tell you, went into the kitchen of our halfway home, where we temporarily house our patients with quadriplegia and paraplegia and their families. And so it nourished them. We spoke with his son and the boy who had inherited the land, and we said, listen, we know you know how to look after this land, but involve your father in the decisions you make. Help him feel connected to this land that he loves so much by asking for his advice. So he did that, and their relationship radically improved after that. So the old farmer died a few weeks later, but completely connected, with dignity and in peace. The story of the fisherman and the farmer are just 2 amongst thousands. And while these 2 men were close to the end of their lives, that's not always the case. I mean, we are all protagonists in our own stories. And we have found over and over again that it is the simple act of listening to what a person thinks is the most important part of their story is what gives us the key that will help us unlock our ability to help them best, or to support them in a way that improves their quality of life, no matter how long that life might be. There are many accomplished and aspiring doctors in this audience today. And not all of you are going to have the luxury of time to do some of the things I've asked you to do, or I've talked about, rather. If you are not already a part of it, you will be forced to join this burgeoning healthcare industry that's falling all over itself, trying to meet the increasing volumes of the sick and the needy patients. Take a moment to reflect when the healthcare service came to be known as the healthcare industry, and when the art of healing gave way to the business of medicine. Today there's a new buzzword. It's called narrative medicine, and I have to read this one out. An interdisciplinary field that brings powerful narrative skills of radical listening and creativity from the humanities and the arts to address the needs of all who seek and deliver healthcare. Narrative medicine enables patients and caregivers to voice their experience, to be heard, to be recognized, and to be valued, improving the delivery of healthcare. I got that definition from the website of an American university. And I suppose it's well put, but at its very core, what it is really talking about is returning to that basic human art of listening to a story with compassion in order to provide true healing. It was the Buddhist nun, Pema Chodron, who said that compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded, it is a relationship between equals. But in order for us to see our patients as our equal, we need to set aside that sense of self that we've spent grueling hours poring over textbooks and journals to put together. We have to set aside that Greek and Latin that we've so painstakingly picked up over the years to create some space and remember the true language of suffering. We have to meet them halfway across that precarious, rickety bridge that they're now walking on. And when they are too weak to go any further, we must go meet them where they are. But in order to know where they are, you have to listen to their stories. Statistically, only 10 to 15% of us will be blessed with a sudden death. For the remaining 85 to 90%, we will most likely be subjected to a prolonged and painful illness. I mean, by now you can see why we palliative care people are so popular at parties, right? I mean, we're constantly and generously doling out this kind of information. I mean, I guess that's why we're not invited back quite often. Anyway, so should I fall within that latter category? And if it falls upon one of you to treat me, I would request this of you. When you are done examining me with your many instruments and machines, when you've measured my blood pressure, charted my neural pathways, and taken a good look at all my organs and tissue using scans and probes and whatever else necessary, take off that white coat that you wear like an armor. Take off that stethoscope that you use to listen to my heart and to my breath, and ask me for my story. See me as not just a repository of disease and illness, but as a person who imagines that she understands the language of trees. I promise I will not reference Dr. Google and tell you how to treat me, but if you listen, I may just show you how you can heal me. Thank you.